I'm going to introduce both of you while you're still here with us right now. And I'll start with Mark. He's our next speaker. He lives in Mark Wade in Johannesburg. He's an art director and assistant director of numerous films, TV series, and commercials. Is the creator and executive producer of Legends and Legacies, a story of a community, an 8-part documentary series on the history and contribution of South African Jews, which I believe many of us have seen and really enjoyed. He studied art and design at the Durban Technikon and filmmaking at the Arts Center College of Design in Los Angeles, and started his film career in one of Hollywood's leading independent animation studios in the 1970s. Mark spent many years as an account director in the advertising industry. And if you'll allow me just to go on while Alan's still with us here. Alan Swerdlow, who also lives in Johannesburg, is an actor, writer, and creative director. He was the writer and presenter of Legends and Legacies. He completed his postgraduate studies at University of Cape Town's Little Theatre. He's one of the most highly acclaimed theatre directors in South Africa, and as well as being a theatre historian. So welcome to you both, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
I think maybe I should first introduce how we got to the subject of possibly our interest in doing a documentary or docudrama, the backstory, the story behind the story to King Kong. And Alan and I obviously worked together on the Legends and Legacies series. And obviously Alan's particular interest was episode 7 that talks about the arts, theatre and drama, plastic arts, and King Kong came up. And at that stage, which is now probably 3 years ago, we sat down and said, well, we need to actually develop this further, and we need to re-look at maybe the backstory to King Kong. I mean, it's a great musical, but maybe there's more behind it, and what's behind it is actually the people. And it's a story about King Kong that we found fascinating. So we spent quite a few months, maybe a few years, exploring how we could go further, how we could take this further. And we've really fine-tuned what's called in the industry a pitch deck. And we're now trying to get one of the big streaming networks to fund it. And that's the next stage. It's incredibly difficult. But I suppose if you don't pursue it, it'll never happen. So we keep knocking on doors, sending people emails, making phone calls, tearing our hair out. But that's the next production we want to do. So as I said, King Kong really was an extension of the Legends and Legacy series, which in itself was a 5-year project. It took me 3 years to raise the funding for that project. When we were doing all the production, we had a big break because of COVID. I think there was a 9-month break or so. Alan, wasn't it? It was quite a while that we couldn't work any longer. We worked with a fantastic Jewish production company in Johannesburg called Clive Morris Productions, and they really handheld us through the whole thing. I went into this project so naively. I mean, really, it was a little inspiration, and it turned into a monster project. And I think if I hadn't found Alan, the project would probably never have happened. You know, I think I had a rather abbreviated idea of what I wanted to do, and Alan really made it happen. It took him, 5 months to do the research, write the script. We had a little library, I think of 2 or 3 books to start with. And by the end of 5 months, we had a library of more than 80 books of reference that we'd been big borrowed and stolen around the country. So getting back to King Kong, it's a fascinating story in that almost the entire production company was Jewish. Except for Pat Williams, who was mentioned a bit earlier, who wrote the lyrics. And there was a black guy called Todd Machikisa, who was a journalist with Glum magazine, and in his own right, a jazz musician. And the guys at Drum magazine had seconded him to this little production happening downtown Johannesburg at Dorkay House, and asked him to follow and see what was going on. And almost out of nowhere, Todd ended up co-writing the music. But in essence, the production crew who were involved were a really interesting collection of guys who just came together really. Now, let me just list their names here. There was the director was Leon Blackman, and the musical director was Stanley Glasser. The decor and costume designer was Arthur Goldreich, who actually got arrested with Nelson Mandela at Lily's Leaf Farm. And I don't think anyone in the production company knew who he was. The choreographer was Arnold Glover, and Pat Williams wrote the lyrics. And Clive Mennell and Todd Matsukisa worked together. And as I mentioned, Clive's wife, Irene, I believe she is still alive and lives in Cape Town. So we have to knock on her door. I think one of the interesting things that we need to put into perspective about King Kong is that it was in the mid-50s when the team got together to devise it. And I want Alan to give a bit more of a story behind it. But when you think of it, in 1948, the most draconian apartheid laws in South Africa were legislated. So, for example, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, the Immorality Act, the Population Act, Group Areas Act, it just goes on. Security bonds were out there, security police, making sure blacks and white people didn't mix. And out of this, so there was 1948 and 55, the Freedom Charter was drafted by Rusty and Hilda Bernstein. So this was 7 years later. At the Kliptown conference, the Freedom Charter was presented. And about the same time as the Freedom Charter being presented, King Kong started coming into life. But by 58, the treason trial had started. So King Kong was launching at exactly the same time as the treason trial was happening in Pretoria. So it was against kind of every single rule was being broken by the production company. And it was an incredible challenge. But out of it, King Kong really was produced. And I'd like Alan to give a little bit more of the background to the production and the staging and the crew. And I don't know whether I should show that little video first that you put together for the Legends series.
Show the video because I'm going to expand on all of that.
Okay,
that was just a very terse reference.
All right. So it's just about 6 minutes or so, but it's just one little excerpt from episode 7, where Alan talks about the production team coming together. So let me try and do this.
Founded the first professional theatre company in the mother city, called the Cockpit Players. It had nothing to do with the aircraft.
And so just after this.
Slang reference to Shakespeare's theatre, it eventually found its permanent home at the Hofstadter Theatre in Cape Town and nurtured a remarkable group of notable South African actors, many of whom went on to international careers such as Sir Nigel Hawthorne, Estelle Kohler, Brian Murray, and Joss Atkins. Schach went on to direct in the USA, Belgium, United Kingdom, Finland, and Italy, as well as his home country, but eventually made Aliyah to Israel and began to direct the Habima and Kamari theatres.
Okay, it's coming up now.
He began to return to South Africa, quest to direct productions for all the major managements, including the New Market Theatre in Johannesburg, as well as one of the productions for the opening of the State Theatre in Pretoria. Someone whose history and achievements paralleled Schach's in many ways was Leon Gluckman. Born in Johannesburg, the son of Henry Gluckman, who served as Minister of Health and Housing in one of Jan Smuts' cabinets, he began his career as an actor. After theatre studies abroad, Leon returned to work for the new National Theatre Organization in South Africa in its inaugural season and was directed by Leontine Sagama. He left South Africa once more to become a member of the Old Vic Company in London, but returned home 2 years later, even as his international reputation was beginning to soar. Surprisingly, once he was resettled here, one of his first activities was to record a series of readings from the Bible for the South African Zionist Federation, released as a long-playing record to raise funds for the Fed. While Gluckman would go on to direct an enviable string of national and international successes, including Wait a Minute, one of his signal achievements was helming the iconic South African musical King Kong, one of the key factors in the development of multiracial theatre in defiance of the apartheid nationalist government, and the launching pad of an astonishing array of talent, including legends such as Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela. Ian Bernhard, a successful actor and director.
Okay, let me take over at this point because I need to give a small background, I think, to why this remarkable group of Jewish people involved in theatre and in entertainment in South Africa set about putting together this remarkable production. And it came down to the fact that, well, South African theatre by that stage was pretty much dominated by the Jewish community. Just to give you a very, very quick précis, the earliest recorded production in South Africa, it was actually in South African waters, was on board a Dutch East India Company ship called the Dragon, and it was in 1608, and they performed Hamlet for the entertainment of the officers and the crew. And from then on, it developed, and just to telescope time and put all of that together, what we had was a slow progression. The Dutch were in charge, of course, of the Cape at that point, followed by the French. And theatre for about 150 years in the history of South Africa was largely garrison theatre, produced within the garrisons of whatever ruling country was in charge at the time. So when the French were in charge of the Cape, we have records of the fact that they did a production of The Marriage of Figaro before it had even been produced on stage in France. They were followed by the British. The garrison theatre was very, very popular at the time, and it was producing entertainment for the new residents of the Cape Colony, as well as for the military folk involved. But towards the end of the 19th century, you had the first of the touring professional companies coming from abroad, a number of them, Disney Roebuck, people like that, coming in. And then with the discovery of gold and the development of Johannesburg, you had the first Jewish companies, as it were, coming in. A very, very interesting guy called Lascombe Sorel came in with his company from the UK. He was known for his own particular little idiosyncrasy of whenever he conducted the overture to one of his productions, he would always don a yarmulke. Nobody quite knows why, but this was noted at the time. Then in came Harry Stodel, who was became the founder of an entire generation of performers, theatre folk who dominated the South African scene. Harry Stodel having had his beginning on the music halls of the UK, followed indeed by Schlesinger, I.W. Schlesinger, who set up the first cinemas in South Africa, the first official studios in South Africa. And in fact, he owned a lot of the theatres in Cape Town, the Opera House, and a couple of the other theatres, and promoted theatre in that way. And then came up on the Rand, the Highveld, Muriel Alexander, who trained as an actress with a Yiddish theatre company in London, came back, set up her own company. It became known as the Johannesburg Repertory Theatre, the Reps, and they were responsible largely for professional theatre in Johannesburg for a lot of the time. And at the same time, she was bringing in a lot of the Yiddish companies into South Africa. And the Johannesburg Reps was succeeded by the National Theatre in South Africa, which was an official company around about 1948, and there was an Afrikaans section and an English section, but it was still dominated by the Jewish communities. We had Leontine Sagan, you had the mention of her, this incredible international reputation. She was, in fact, in charge for quite a while of one of the sections of the National Theatre. And in this mix was Leon Gluckman. And he developed as an actor in South Africa. He was here, there, he was everywhere. Leonard Schach had his company in Cape Town, which is called the Cockpit Players. And he was part of that, as well as doing a lot of stuff up in Johannesburg. He went off, as you heard, back to Britain, joined the Old Vic Company, rose very quickly in the ranks, toured all over the world with the Old Vic Company, a particularly famous tour to Australia with Laurence Olivier and a lot of other people, big names. And his star was really rising. But he decided to return to South Africa in the early 50s. And he then spoke about the necessity, because at this point, with the apartheid laws being instituted in South Africa, he realized that the chance for a non-racial, inclusive South African theater was being eroded very, very quickly. And one of the things he set out to do was to make sure that there was some attempt at a non-racial, truly South African theater. At the same time, you had Ian Bernhardt and Harry Bloom, who were both involved in the Union of South African Artists. They set up this organization. It was largely a music rights organization to look after musicians. But because of the prompting from Ian Bernhardt, they decided that they would also incorporate staged performances, and Ian Bernhardt himself staged a very famous production under the auspices of that union of South African artists. He staged a production of Comedy of Errors. It was the first all-black performance of a Shakespeare in South Africa. And that is how, in fact, he became friendly with Harry Bloom, who had seen the production, wanted to work with him, and they were casting about for a project. At that time, two of the pieces that they knocked about and they mentioned between them was, of course, the most famous jazz opera of them all, Porgy and Bess, which had been composed by Gershwin. And there was also, the movie had just been released in South Africa of Carmen Jones, which was an all-black adaptation of Carmen and set in an American military base. They'd seen this, they thought, it's fantastic, we've got to do something similar. And Harry Bloom lighted on the story of Ezekiel Dlamini, who was this noted boxer in South Africa, who had risen to a certain level of greatness until he was thwarted by the apartheid laws because he could not box against white boxers. And he had a somewhat stormy personal life, though he'd become this huge hero of the townships. And in a fit of jealousy, he murdered his girlfriend, was arrested, was imprisoned, and whilst he was in prison, at Zonderwater prison, he committed suicide. He drowned himself in the lake on the property of the Zonderwater prison. And Harry Bloom thought this would make a fantastic jazz opera. So they started casting around for people to join them on the project. And they lit upon Leon Gluckman because of his avowed intention of promoting non-racial theatre, and through him, because it was a very small community at the time, the professional theatre community, through Leon Gluckman, they lighted upon Arthur Goldreich, who did the designs, the sets and the costumes and the poster and the record cover and all sorts of aspects. And actually, I must just correct you, Mark, they knew perfectly well that his political record was something that was noted, and they thought it would be a huge plus. They also brought in Pat Williams to be the lyricist, and then there was just check the list because I don't want to leave anybody else out. We had the Mennels, Irene and Clive Mennel mentioned as well. And we also had a Stanley Glasser, of course. Stanley was brought in particularly for the music, and he became, in fact, the music director of the piece and composed some of the music, though it was Todd Matshikiza who composed the vast majority. And there was also Arnold Dover. Yep.
I just thought maybe at this stage you could discuss the influence of American jazz on the Black community in Sophiatown primarily. You know, we had groups that were called the Four Woody Woodpeckers and the Manhattan Brothers. So there was quite a distinct difference between what the sort of white community were following as music and what the Black community were producing, where they had produced their particular Afro jazz, South African Afro jazz that was unique to our country, and obviously that was through Todd. That element of the music was then influenced the production.
Yeah, well, it as you say, it was this Afro jazz aspect, and that came particularly from Harry Bloom, who was not a musician himself, but he was aware the center of Afro jazz in South Africa was happening in Sophiatown, in the clubs, in the basements there, and this extraordinary array of talent emerged. And there were quite a few members of the white community who were sneaking off to Sophiatown. It hadn't been segregated out at that point. It was later to come when Sophiatown was destroyed and Triumph was re-erected in its place. But at that time, I mean, that was a political center, a hotbed. That's where Nelson Mandela was working. But the way the people who lived within Sophiatown let off steam, unwound, was to go to these jazz clubs, and they had this wonderful range of musicians doing incredible things, and they were adapting American jazz into a South African context, giving it a South African beat, altering some of the tonalities and the way in which the music was developed. So it was becoming uniquely South African, Pan-African in that way, rather than being strictly an American product. So yes, indeed. And when Arnold Dover, who became the choreographer, was brought on board, he had worked on a number of productions already using South African jazz, and was ready to incorporate that style of dancing into what would become King Kong. The initial thing, and this came from the Mennels, the initial thing was that United Artists, South African artists, set up a series of concerts, jazz concerts. And they had two very, very big ones, which were huge successes and managed to restore the coffers of United Artists. And the Mennels thought that it was time to get on with doing a South African musical that would be Black and would reflect the South African stories. So they set about, it was particularly through them that the money was being raised, and it was £5,000 here, £5,000 there from various companies and individuals who were prepared to invest in what looked like a very shaky project to begin with, but rose to become one of the greatest successes in South Africa. The fact was, it was going to be an all-black cast, and they needed to find the people who could perform. And that's what Leon Gluckman set about doing, casting around, auditioning people, trying to bring people together. And the production set off within a warehouse at the bottom end of Loveday Street, which was known as the Dungeon because it was down in the basement. And that's where they used to rehearse every evening, because these people weren't professionals who were coming in to perform. They had their daytime jobs. They would get off work, hare across town, and would settle in to the basement. And Leon Gluckman had the unenviable task of having to teach people to perform as well as direct the piece all simultaneously as it was going on. It was an enormous task. Stanley Glasser was, of course, trying to do the musical direction. And again, they were trying to teach professional standards to the company. There was a further aspect which made things very, very difficult indeed, which was, of course, the apartheid laws. You had something called the pass laws at the time, which meant that there was a curfew within white Johannesburg. All blacks had to be out by a certain time and back out to the townships. If you were needed for various reasons, you could get a pass that would allow you to stay on in town after curfew. And they set about finding passes for the majority of the company. They got people to hire them, as it were, to work in bars and in restaurants, but they weren't going to the bars and the restaurants, they were going off to rehearsals. Eventually, after they had been arrested and stopped and halted so many times, they made an appeal to the police to make an exception for this company, and they actually issued towards the end something that was known as the King Kong Pass. And so it was in a space of 3.5 months that they brought the production together, had the sets designed, the costumes made, learnt the music, learnt the songs, learnt basic staging, little tryouts that they had, people coming in to watch and comment on the progress. There was an enormous hype that was developing at the time. At the same time, of course, they had to gather a crew to work on the production backstage, and even that backstage crew ended up by being largely Jewish. And Percy Tucker had just started show services, which precursed the CompuTicket in South Africa, the booking system for South Africa. And he was going to be selling the tickets, and he was going to be in charge of marketing. So slowly, this all started to together. It seemed to be an insane project, but it was happening. They were rehearsing like mad. They had to find somewhere to perform it because it was going to be a black cast. They needed to find a non-racial venue, and the place that came up was the Great Hall on the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, because the apartheid laws did not apply there at the time. Later on, a lot of restrictions were put into place, and one of the things that, to begin with, the government pushed was that though it was ostensibly non-segregated, there was an effort in the beginning, to make the seating, the rows alternate. So a black row of attendees, followed by a white row of audience, and then a black row, and so on. It all fell apart very, very quickly, and in the end, it was dropped. That system was dropped.
Alan,
But February the 2nd,
can I just pop in and ask a kind of a question while we were talking about this collaboration? Critics at the time said that it was a bunch of Jewish guys exploiting black people, which I suppose today we call cultural appropriation. However, there's also a statement by Leon Gluckman where he says, I would like to say the Jewish spirit has to some undefined extent entered into the production of King Kong. So there seems to be a kind of a two-sided thing. I mean, was the media, was the press harshly critical because of this collaboration, or was it a kind of a political stance that they were taking that whites and black people shouldn't perform together?
Well, that came much later. To begin with, there was enormous support from the press. It was only very few places, when the production had already been running for some time and went on tour in South Africa, that there was a for and against. For example, Pretoria refused to allow permission for the musical to be performed there. Other places it was allowed. There were a few people within the black community who felt that this was cultural appropriation and it shouldn't be done. And they were immediately answered by the members of the company and a lot of other people, including Nelson Mandela himself, saying that no, this was the way in which to get things done. And it was a genuine South African production. It got a hell of a lot worse when it went to the UK.
And that was the next question I wanted to ask. What do you know about the UK performances?
Well, as I say, the South African production opened to rapturous response. You could not get a ticket. There were fistfights outside show service, people trying to get in. Not as many black audiences were coming, but simply that was a matter of the cost of the ticket. And they started subsidizing at one point. At a later stage, they made other cheaper tickets available. The reviews were laudatory. It was a huge success, and the international production came about because producers came in from the UK. They'd heard about this amazing production, came in to watch it, and it was decided to bring it to London for a season in London. It was hoped that it was going to be a season of about a year at the Prince's Theatre. Did not last that long, because while it was lauded, whilst there was a very big response to the piece itself, and people really enjoyed it to begin with, there was a kind of lack of understanding about the context, because the British audiences thought it was going to be a critique of what the apartheid system was doing in South Africa. And the intention all along from the beginning was that it was going to be a musical. They were telling a story. They were telling the story of Ezekiel Dlamini, known as King Kong. And there were Leon Gluckman was continually having to respond to various letters to the editor and people writing articles saying that it was not intended as a critique of the apartheid system. This was intended as an attempt to bring together two parts of the South African society and unify them in an act of creation. But there seemed to be that expectation at the time from the British critics that they wanted what I suppose we would now know as protest theatre. And that only came along later. That came along in the 80s, and particularly under the aegis of Bonnie Simon and Manny Manham and Market Theatre, and it became a dominant aspect. But at the time of the production, they were trying to do a musical with a very strong story that was particularly South African, that had a South African sound, that had an all South African creative crew behind it, and was ready to stand up and take its place alongside Carmen Jones and places like that. It didn't happen, it wasn't received in that way. And the production lasted a very respectable 6 months in London at the Prince's Theatre. But it was quite clear that it was not going to make the year out. And because of that, it was not going to make the Broadway jump.
So there's another quote by Leon Gluckman where it says, "There's been a genuine cooperation between black and white, and in a small way it has brought understanding, which is much better than the fear which informs the relationship between the two sectors." So I think that's a very nice way of putting it, that at that time there was this, because of the laws of apartheid, this environment had been created with Swart Gevaar and, you know, communism and, you know, all these kind of evils that had been perpetuated by the National Party. They were intentionally creating this divide. And in the meantime, United Artists and the crew were actually doing the opposite. They were saying, you know, all of that is irrelevant. White and black people can get together to produce something that is magnificent.
Absolutely, that kind of puts it in a nutshell, pretty much, in terms of the intention, in terms of how it developed. I mean, the show was the launching pad of the most extraordinary range of performers and musicians. I mean, in the band was Kippie Moletsi, Sol Plaster, Makai Davashe, Jonas Gwangwa, and of course Hugh Masekela. I mean, that was part of the band. Those are names that went on to international reputations in their own right. You had Miriam Makeba playing.
Yeah, Abigail Quebecer.
Abigail, Miriam. I mean, it was an app, and as you mentioned, the Woody Woodpeckers and the Manhattan Brothers, they were subsumed into the cast, things like that. It was extraordinary. But when it became clear that the production was going to fold eventually, was going to close down, the question arose, was everyone going to return home to South Africa? And at that point, a lot of people decided to seek asylum in the UK. And they decided to stay on, they would not return. And though a large portion of the cast did come back home, a lot went voluntarily into exile. They found things very, very difficult in Britain at the time, because that was in the very early 60s. I mean, they were up against the Windrush generation. They were up against an incipient racism that had not disappeared from the British landscape. And a lot of them were miserable and were not coping. Some chose to leave the UK and go into exile elsewhere in Africa. The winds of change were blowing, and we had the first independent African states coming up. And some tried to make it in America, Hugh Masekela being one of them in particular.
And Miriam Makeba too.
Yeah, and Miriam Makeba. Miriam had left the company beforehand at that stage. She was being coached by Harry Belafonte as an independent star, and she was trying to make it as such, and that's why she ended up in the United States. But there's a kind of tragic end to it, because so many of the people who went into exile had miserable lives. They weren't happy abroad. They would much rather have been home. But having sought asylum outside of the country under the apartheid laws, they could not return. They did not want to be under this repressive regime. And it all kind of dwindled out. In 1979,
while they were in London, the treason trial was happening. So, you know, they knew the writing was on the wall that, you know, either you had to bow down and accept apartheid for what it was, or you were going to go to jail. So,
and again, the extraordinary thing was the treason trial held in the end within the confines of what had been the Pretoria synagogue.
yes, of course.
Into a courtroom whilst the Palace of Justice was being built in Pretoria. A lot of the people involved in the defense of the treason trial were Jewish. There just was this at the time. Yeah, Izzy Maisels, perfect example, and a lot more. Sidney Kentridge later on was instructed. It was a moment when somehow the Jewish community and the Black community, and one shouldn't talk in terms of vast generalizations, but there was, to use the Afrikaans word, a toenadering. There was an understanding within the Jewish community. People thought that it might become a kind of the Jews would be next situation. So alliances were sought under the time. But the formation of King Kong, if I may just sum it up very, very quickly, the idea of actually doing King Kong was this very brave leap into making a bid for a truly South African theatre, which was completely non-racial and would create and produce things on its own terms and stand for itself as a voice for the whole South African nation. And that's why it became such a symbol and has been the symbol for so long. There was a disastrous attempt at a revival in 1979 with an American producer and director who came in, rewrote the book, tried to make it far more American. That failed disastrously. There was the attempt recently at the Fugard again to revive the show, but that too brought in a whole lot of outsiders from abroad to work on making the show palatable to an international audience. And the fact, the great success that was seen in South Africa by its 2 years of performance in South Africa, that initial run, was because it spoke to South Africans, and South Africans understood it. And the whole notion of trying to get an international voice was perhaps a mistake and something that damaged the reputation. Had it finished its run in South Africa, it would remain as a shining light of South African theatre and one of the most successful shows ever done in this country.
I think, just from in terms of the summary, you can see why Alan and I are so excited about doing a docudrama of the backstory to King Kong, because it is such an incredible story and so fascinating, and it happened at such a particular time in South Africa's history, and for it just to fade away into mythology, we hate to see it disappear. And I think it's not only a Jewish story; it's a South African story, and it's a story about hope, and it's a story about fear. And I think one of the names of one of the tracks is "Sad Times, Bad Times." We wonder whether that's ever going to change. We still seem to be in the same cycle of uncertainty. But
Great.
Thank you.
Gail, I don't know if there are questions, if there's time for questions.
There is time. Geraldine you'll host this little bit.
Oh, right. Okay.
This is really fascinating. I was at university at Wits in 1958, and I remember the excitement and going and being an usher. I think, Judy, you'd remember that too. And, feeling engaged with this production in a big way. It was really terrific, and it's very interesting. I'm sure there may be questions I want to ask is, was it ever recorded, filmed? Did anybody ever film the show?
No, it was never done. and even the very limited stills photographs. There's some anecdotal stories. For example, Paula Sleer, the Middle Eastern journalist, her father was one of the stagehands, and I know Alan has written a bit about him. There was an interview with him, but there was nothing that was filmed, which I think was quite sad. There's just no documentary done at all. And I think in a way that's another impetus for us to try and really retell that story, but from the backstory point of view.
There had been a handful of movies that dealt with African stories, South African stories, Black stories. At that time, The Magic Garden was one, Jim Comes to Joburg was another, where they actually made films. Of course, there was the film of Cry the Beloved Country, was the Hollywood team coming in en masse with American actors and performers, including Sidney Poitier, and filming Cry the Beloved Country in South Africa. But in those days, generally, there was very little attempt at archiving anything. People couldn't afford cameras. To actually film a sequence with the right amount of lighting and decent sound and things like that was prohibitively expensive. And though there are a few photographs, one of the reasons that we couldn't show you photographs now is that it is a maze of rights and who owns what at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to disentangle that. It's a great pity. The recent production that was done at the Fugard was, for record purposes, was filmed, and it is, I think, within the archive of the Fugard, which actually no longer exists. It is now attached to the District 6 Museum as a theatre, but that recording should certainly be in their archive. But beyond that, no. And Percy Tucker, who was one of the major people who's been, prior to his death, was trying as far as possible to assemble an archive of South African theatre and productions like that and get them into Grahamstown to be preserved in a library there. It's unlike like the story of the Jewish music in South Africa, it's almost too late. A lot of the material has been lost, and it's sad.
Danielle, you wanted to say something.
Yes. Good evening, and thank you so much for that talk. It was absolutely fascinating. I did see King Kong at the Athol Fugard Theatre some years ago, and I'm Herbert Kretzmer's daughter. I don't know if you know of him. You might do.
Oh yes, we do.
But he was very good friends with the Glassers and with Gluckman, with Leon, and he used to always say about Leon Gluckman, if ever he was mentioned, my father always said he was the best of us. And so I know he meant a great deal to him, but I just wanted to ask you about the program, about the program you're putting together, and is that for South African? When you said about approaching a network, are you talking about South African television? Do you think this is a predominantly South African story, or do you think it has a wider scope?
Well, to answer your question, for example, for our Legends and Legacy series, although we were trying to get international distribution, we were limited to geolocated, I think that's the expression, on Prime Video to Africa only, which I think was rather sad, and the networks felt it was a South African story and only Africans would be interested. So although the same would probably apply to King Kong, that we have to deal through an agent, and an agent deals with the network, so we can't deal with them directly, and that's how their structure works. So all we can do is hope that well, firstly, we need to get the funding to do the production. But secondly, we hope that once the production is completed, that it will get international release. So it's nothing that we can ever control. It depends on the network and who they think would be interested in it. So, you know, it's unlike a big blockbuster movie that will have an international appeal. And invariably a big budget American or British production. They don't, you know, South African productions are very low on their priority list. Although they did buy them, but they don't pay much for them, and they're restricted.
We are hoping, though, to Danielle, to try and interest some of the streaming networks at the moment, because they're starting to accept more South African stuff. But if it doesn't have that instant international recognition factor, it takes a lot of persuasion. I'm sure you know.
Yes, I do. Okay, well, maybe, I mean, I'm based in the UK, and maybe Geraldine can arrange for us to swap email addresses and we can just chat further about this.
Yeah, no,
that would be great.
Yeah.
That really would be.
If I can help in any way. And
so what we've done, we've put together quite comprehensive, what they call pitch decks.
a treatment.
It's more than a treatment. It's a multiple page thing which gives a mood board. It gives a breakdown of the episodes. It talks about who the characters are, the production company. It really is an elaborate thing. It even shows you images of the particular settings.
Oh, okay.
So it's called a pitch deck. So essentially, it's taking your executive summary and fleshing it out into a 20-page document. So we do have those, and we're working with the production company here who we worked with on the Legends project, who have put all those together because they understand how the streamers think. So, you know, we're all prepared to go to market. We have cost estimates and what it would be to produce. We have a team to put together, and everything really is there. It's a case of someone coming along with a checkbook and saying, please do the production and we'll be happy to sponsor you, you know.
Yes.
I know the UK,
Okay.
through their, they have various organizations who do, like the BFI, for example, who do funding. Fortunately, I'm dual national, I'm a Brit, so they would talk to me, but I don't know who to speak to there. That would be quite important. You can't just send blanket emails to, you know, info@BFI and hope they're going to respond to you. You do need to have names and addresses and speak to people and have personal introductions.
Yeah.
That's the only way these guys work.
Well,
Lovely.
we're
Okay,
very
well, maybe
happy
we
to
can
put it
chat.
together. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. It was fascinating.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely.
May I throw in a last anecdote, which is one of the things I love, because Percy Tucker had a wicked sense of humor and very strong opinions. And he was on duty at show services, and shall we say, a northern suburbs Johannesburg white madam arrived in tow, demanding tickets to see the show, but please do not seat me next to one of them. I don't wish to sit next to a black person. And Percy Tucker said, of course, madam, and made sure she was seated. She was jammed in between an entire row on either side of black members of the audience. Percy's revenge.
And we were lucky to interview him before he passed away.
Lovely. And Santi has given the address of the Percy Tucker collection in the Eastern Cape. Gail, you wanted to say?
Okay, I won't speak for very long because we've all been sitting for quite a long time. I just wanted to say that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. And when you were talking, both of you actually, and I'm not in the world of, you know, commercial productions, etc., it sounded to me like one of the most fascinating South African stories I've really heard for ages. And it was, you know, it reminded me of the stories we used to hear as children and reading them and whatever. It's like there's something quite kind of childlike about the story. you know, the good and the bad and the what happened, and then it had bad luck and all things that went wrong and went right. And that's just what my impression and feeling was. So thank you so much. And of course, Danielle, we're looking forward to hearing you talk about your dad next time. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much for the
Lovely.
opportunity. It was really nice having a chat, and I feel as I've got something off my chest that Alan and I have been talking about for so long, and constantly trying to convince people to buy into what we want to do.
Now, you need to take maybe a leaf out of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's book. When they wanted to present Jesus Christ Superstar, they first produced the album and released the songs, and the songs became popular, and that became something that people talked about. So I think you need to find a song and get it on the radio and make people sort of prick up their ears and think about it. And that might help the whole process. So that's my little piece of strategy. Thank you so much. I mean, we've been really happy to provide this platform to bring us back to this very exciting time of what could have been, and what did happen, and you know how it can happen again. And interesting that Danielle, you saw the production, a later production. So you know that's another thing. You need to get a production going and film it. I mean, you know, there needs to be some clips or some interviews, or you know, talk to these people. But I'm sure you've got it all lined up, and it's very good. So next week is the end of our music seminars. So, or the end of the ones for the moment. We're looking forward to having Danielle talk about her dad. You better be there to hear it, because we're not able, again, for copyright reasons and things like that, we won't be able to record it. But we're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So just come and hear it. And we're also going to hear the story of the Johannesburg Jewish Male Choir, which had international fame and traveled the world. So that will be the end of our current series. If you've got ideas or thoughts about other things you'd like to hear about in another series, please email me and we'll talk about it. You want to be on the committee of CHOL, we've got spaces, you know, it's your forum, it's your platform, and we want you to come and dance on it. So thank you all very much.